Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Rahmanirrahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. We begin in the name of Allah, most merciful and compassionate. Whether we're Muslims or Sufis or anything else, we should begin in the name of our Lord. We're living in a period of atheism and agnosticism everywhere. So in order to detox that aspect of our society, we have to keep remembering Allah. I do it wherever I can, especially with atheists and agnostics, just to remind people will call me contrarian. Maybe I am. Bismillah. Okay, so let me first of all situate us in the process. So this series of tapes, of videos, it's getting to be a fairly considerable amount of videos, is really an introduction to Sufism, because I don't find there's very good material on the internet anywhere on Sufism, and you can get lost in some of it. So lots of material on Islamic ilm and sciences, but very little on actual Sufism. So I'm hoping to compensate for that by the tapes that I'm doing here. So we've run through many of the basic subjects that are relevant to the Sufi way, and we started talking about specific Sufi personalities, specifically Abu Yazid al-Bistami and al-Junaid Baghdadi, and we have three more that I'd like to cover before we finish this series, which will be Jalaluddin Rumi, Ibn al-Arabi, and Rabia al-Adwiya, a great female mystic. Today we'll be covering some basic terms, and then we'll consider that the package is more or less complete, i.e. that after that I have the intention of not doing this every week like I'm doing it now, but as we used to say in medicine, PRN, in other words, as needed. If a subject comes up that's relevant or that's, maybe in the news or in my heart or in an experience where I feel the need is to talk about it, then we'll do tapes as we go, but not in a systematic way weekly as we're doing right now. Okay, so that's the plan. So we have three other Sufis to cover. Today we're going to cover some basic terminology, and then we'll consider that round one of this package is complete. So today we're talking about a number of Sufi terms that Sufis take for granted, and many of them other people either they don't know or they don't understand the implications, including Muslims, many times. Okay. Probably the most important, most significant term in the Sufi lexicon is, I'm going to ask our leading student, Hadi.
I have a blank now. Give it Fana.
Okay, we've already covered Fana and Baka. Those are the deepest stages of Sufism.
Okay.
But another very important one. See, there's a lot of things to cover. Although dhikr is very present in the Islamic lexicon also, meaning thinking of God, remembering God. But the term I wanted to direct our attention to
is the practice, not jihad and nafs, but
you're close.
yes,
Nafs. Nafs. This is crucial to understand. And this term, nafs, can be translated many ways. This is something I have a bee in my bonnet about, the way they translate nafs. Now, in pure Arabic, nafs means the identity of something. Okay, but that doesn't get us very far in terms of understanding the spiritual practice. So you can talk about, people talk even about the nafs of Allah. Did you know that? Or the nafs of what is the nature of this water bottle? It has a nafs. Everything has a nafs. It's its identity as opposed to its name. But the way the Sufis use nafs, it's the enemy. Okay. We have four enemies. This is Islamic teachings, but also very important in Sufism. What are the four enemies?
Nafs,
Nafs,
Shaitan,
shaitan, which is the devil,
Hawa,
hawa, which is desire,
Dunya.
and dunya, which is worldliness. Okay. Most Muslims know about that. But what we specialize in Sufism is the jihad an-nafs. Jihad meaning the battle or the war against the ego. So our Holy Prophet ﷺ, I believe this was after the battle of Badr when they had won the battle, and he said, you may have won the battle, the lesser jihad al-askar, the smaller jihad. And the companions asked him, so what is the greater jihad? And he said, it's the jihad against the nafs, jihad an-nafs. That is the basic, most important Sufi practice, fighting against the ego. Now, we're not the only ones who fight against the ego. Anyone who does a lot of meditation, the Buddhists, some of the Hindus, some of the Christians, there's a very interesting story here about jihad an-nafs that I think Muslims are aware of, but anyway, it's definitely worth repeating. So in the city of Medina, the holy city of Medina, Umar, who was the second caliph, the third after Muhammad, peace be upon him, Abu Bakr, and then Umar ibn Farouk al-Khattab, Umar al-Khattab, heard that there was a Jewish man, there were still Jews in Medina, who had all kinds of psychic powers. So Umar was a curious guy, and he wanted to find out what's going on here. So he went to the Jewish man, and he said, I heard you have all these clairvoyant psychic powers. How did you get it? And the man said, it's very simple. So Umar said, okay, tell me. He said, whenever my nafs, he knew about nafs. Any mystic is going to know about the ego. He knew about it. He said, whenever my nafs wants something, I do the opposite. Challenge anyone that's listening to this tape to do that. You won't succeed. We're all used to doing the will of our nafs. The nafs wants this kind of ice cream. So if his nafs wanted, I don't think they had ice cream. Chocolate ice cream, he'd order vanilla ice cream. It's an interesting practice. He said, whenever my nafs want something, I do the opposite. And Umar said, oh, that's very interesting. So he said, he was a clever one, Sheikh Nazim would say, clever one, this Umar. He said, ask your nafs what it thinks about becoming Muslim. And so the Jews went, he got all upset. Like the jinn do when they hear the Quran or something about jinn. Shayateen. So he got all upset, and then he caught himself and he realized, he said, okay, ashhadu an la ilaha. He accepted Islam because he saw that his nafs didn't want Islam. And nafs does not like Islam. Unfortunately, a lot of the Muslim nafs now don't like Sufism. You see, Sufis, terrible people of bid'ah, people of kufr, people of this, that, everything. They haven't studied their history, and they've been bamboozled by the Wahhabis, or in some cases the Ikhwanis, or whoever else, against the Sufis. But the Sufis are the purest. I'm not saying that to promote myself, but in general, the Sufis are the deepest, most clairvoyant, most pious of the Muslims, the real Sufis, not the corrupt ones. They're corrupt gurus in all the traditions. So this is nafs, the ego, and the whole way, this entire way, is based on struggling against the ego. So it's important that you understand it. Now, there are a number of problems that arise One of the problems that arises is in the translation. I've had many arguments, especially with those infuriating perennialists about their translation. They're classically, some of them know Arabic very well, and they all translate the ego as the soul, which goes completely against anyone who's been raised in an Anglophone environment. The soul for us is the spiritual part. So they may be using soul in an old English sense of the word soul, but soul is a completely wrong, misleading translation of nafs. Nafs is ego, or one of my favorite translators, Mukhtar Holland, may his soul rest in peace, is to translate it as the lower self, or the carnal self. That is the correct understanding of ego. Now, the psychologists also talk about ego, but for Freud, ego was not the problem, it was the solution. It was part of the rational mind, and we had to go look for the ego as against the id and the superego. So in psychology, sometimes the ego is almost deified, is idealized, but it shouldn't be. Because the whole spiritual practice is about surrendering your nafs, your ego, to the divine will. So nafs is very important, and struggling with it is, as the French say, incontournable. How would you translate that? Incontrovertible. You can't get away without it. And there are many, many people on religious paths who are still dominated by their ego, who are still dominated by their anger and their lust and their rigidity and everything else. I'll just read you what, there was a good definition by Al-Kushairi, I think, about this. 26. Yes. Okay. It's from the book we've been reading. One of the best books, by the way, after Quran and Sunnah. Ibn Atta'illah's aphorisms and this Risala of Kushairi are some of the best books on Islam and Sufism. The Sufis do not mean by nafs the question of identity, what the nafs of a thing. They mean by nafs those qualities of the servant that are diseased, and whatever there is in his character and actions that is blamable. It is made up of pride, anger, hatred, envy, bad behavior, intolerance, and other blameworthy characteristics. I think you get the message. So it's our enemy, not our friend. Although Sheikh Nazim advised us, don't be too hard on the ego. And he used the analogy of training a horse. He said, the ego is your horse. It's like what you ride on. So we don't want to break its leg. We want to train it, but we don't want to break it. Okay, so some people, this is one of the religious perversions, is to be so hard on yourself that something breaks. I've seen people go psychotic by doing too much meditation, or there's some people who, beat themselves with chains in certain religious traditions, and you don't want to, break yourself, but you do want to train yourself. Now the second term, there's actually three terms. There's the kalb also, which is important. We talked about the stations of the kalb earlier on. The kalb is the heart, but as far as I can see, there are, just like the real heart, you have two atriums and two ventricles. There's two levels of the heart. One is those coarse emotions. That's not what the Sufis are talking about when they talk about the heart. They're talking about the subtle heart. And the subtle heart has insight and intuition and understanding and inner vision. Those are all in the heart, which is the kalb, or sometimes the fuad in Arabic. And so that heart is part of the solution, not like the ego, part of the problem. But the other thing we hear about in the Sufi lexicon, so we have the ego, the nafs, the qalb, the heart, and we have the soul, what I translate as soul, which is the ruh. Okay, and some people say spirit. I find that gets a little bit new agey, the term spirit, oh, I see these spirits. It gets a bit occult. So I prefer just straight soul as the translation of ruh. And in the Quran itself, it tells us, this is the Yusuf Ali translation, ayah 29 in Surah 15, after I have fashioned him, man, this is Allah speaking, He fashioned him, I breathed into him of my soul, not nafs, ruh. So Allah, God, has a soul also, and we are the creations of that soul. We are the extensions or the manifestations, I think extensions is a better term here, of the soul. So somewhere inside of us, and all the mystics tell us that, we have God inside of us, and that part inside of us that is connected directly to God is the ruh, okay, which is the soul. Now some of these things can not be necessarily clear just in theory. You have to kind of experience them. But when you do, it's very powerful. You can see your personal soul merging. Sheikh Abu Qasim called this istighraq. The soul, the individual soul being drowned in the divine soul. Okay? The drop of water fusing with the ocean. That's the ultimate spiritual experience that we're all seeking if we're on the spiritual path. Okay, so Allah breathes the soul into us, and this soul can connect back with His soul, either in a way that they're both separate, or in a way that they're fused, and then we're in fana and baka, when they're fused. There's no more individual soul. And the Hindus and Buddhists speak about that as samadhi, enlightenment, satori. The individual soul is annihilated, fana, in the divine soul. And then you're in the divine consciousness. Now there's a semantic issue here that none of the Muslim scholars have been able to explain to me, and I think it's because it's not really explainable, or there's no way they can defend it, is that the word in English, and even in French it's not as clear, consciousness is a very important mystical term. And it doesn't exist in Arabic. It doesn't even exist in French. Very interesting. Je pense donc je suis, said Descartes, which is complete falsehood. It's not because you think that you are. You can be without thinking. In fact, it's much better when you are without thinking. Okay, so this is consciousness, and there's no real equivalent word. Some people have told me word, but they're almost never used. So they may have a word in Arabic, but it's not in the common vocabulary of consciousness. And this has important spiritual implications. For example, next week we'll be covering Rumi. The week after, we'll be covering Ibn al-Arabi. And one of the concepts that came from Ibn al-Arabi's thought that the Sufis talk about a lot is wahadat al-wujud, the singularity of existence. And there was a lot of debate about it, and I think if you talk just about existence, you can't accept that notion. And then there were people after him, Mujadid Al-Iftani from India, who criticized it and said that's a wrong concept. It's really wahadat al-shuhud, the singularity of witnessing. So there's some truth to it, but some falsehoods. The bottom line is, if you think in terms of consciousness, you can get to one consciousness, the divine consciousness only. Okay? Whereas if you talk about the divine being, at least as I understand it, there's always going to be the created beings and the divine being. So you can't get to real oneness if you're thinking in terms of existence, wujud. But if you're thinking in terms of consciousness, you can even have the experience, inshallah, those who decide to practice Sufism will have the experience of one consciousness, which is the absolute divine consciousness, and that's all that exists at some point. Okay. So if that word had existed in Arabic, they would have been able to skip the entire debate about wahad al-wujud. But it doesn't, and possibly part of this is because there's some aspect to the Semitic languages that are very concrete. So existence is something you can see, and consciousness is not something you can see. It's something you feel. Not that the Westerners haven't totally got lost in the outward and what you can see and empiricism and all that. My blog is full of articles denouncing that approach. Okay, so that's ego, nafs, ruh, wujud, existence. Now, another word that's really important that I talk about a lot, and people hear it in my comments, is hal. The hal means the state of being. In fact, I wrote a poem about it, but no one liked the poem, so I don't say it very often. But the poem is titled, "It's All in the Hal." And it's true. The entire Sufi way, the entire mystical way is in the state. I was talking with one of my students, and he was arguing with a Wahhabi, and I was showing him some pictures of Wahhabis. Once your eyes open, you can more or less see the hal that the person is in, the state that they're in. And I say, just show him this picture. It was Ibn Abbas. You look at that picture, you can't possibly, if you have any insight, you can't possibly follow a person like that. You see mostly darkness. This is not, Islam is light. Sufism is light upon light. If it's darkness, it can't be right. The hal is wrong. When I was working full time, I was working as a psychiatrist. I used to go to these psychiatric conventions and see my colleagues. I was shocked. Really. When we were working together, I didn't know. So you go to a conference, and they're almost, I found 2 or 3 in all of Montreal who weren't like that. They were all in darkness. Their hal was dark. The modern occultists and psychics, they call it the aura. Okay, the aura was all dark. There was no luminosity in their aura, in any of them. Now, there were 2 or 3. That's a whole other story. But the vast majority of them, in darkness. Their hal is, when they're in darkness, you know, I've had 2 experiences in Islam like that. And they're very telling. One was one time with I was invited to the friend of my ex-wife's, and I didn't realize it was a Shia gathering. And as the Shias do, they were trying to convince me that their way of understanding Islam was correct. And at first I argued a bit about it, you know, as any good Sunni would do. But they were like really persistent. They wouldn't let it be. And they kept going. At one point I said, look, and I had this same encounter, almost exactly identical, with a group of Wahhabis in Jordan. I said, look, I look at all your faces. I don't see any light. It's all darkness. How do you want me to accept your words? So if the hal is bad, the words are meaningless. And you have to learn to read the hal. You can do that. You do enough Sufi practices and your eyes will open. I've seen it with some of my students. And then you can see people's hal and you say, there's no way I can believe anything this person says. He's in such a bad hal. We have something like that on the political front, by the way. for those who follow a lot of politics. RFK Jr. Now, I'm trying to teach here, so don't get all stirred up about this as backbiting. I think this is the way we can understand some things. Now, RFK Jr., what he says is almost impeccable. Everything he says is backed up by facts and studies and analytical thought. Everything he says is impeccable. But his hal is terrible. One of my brothers is very enthusiastic about him. And I would be, if I just listened to the content, which is what most people do, by the way, big mistake, just listen to the content. Oh yeah, this person makes sense. Beware if they make sense. And you look at the hal, you say, there's no way. There's something wrong. Something very wrong there. And once you get to see the hal of people, you'll be surprised. Some people you thought were really good really aren't. And then other people you thought were relatively foolish, and they're actually okay. Because their hal is good, which means their heart is good, which means on some level they're connected to their soul, and therefore they're trustworthy. When I first became Muslim, I was in Jerusalem. And as you can imagine, in East Jerusalem, on the Arab side, and I would go over to the Hebrew side to read stuff about Islam, ironical. But there were no libraries, obviously, on the East side. So I would go over to the Hebrew University, and I would read Al-Bukhari. The Muslims will be flabbergasted. He learned his Islam on the Hebrew side. He must be a Zionist. But they had good books on Islam in the Hebrew library. One day I come in, and there's this man, this short man at the front. He's having a Rumpelstiltskin, for those who know. Do you know that Grimm's fairy tale? He's having a Rumpelstiltskin moment, and he's shouting at the secretary at the front desk of the library in Hebrew something. And then when he leaves, I ask the lady, very nicely, what's going on here? She said, do you know who this man is? I said, no. She said, he's the head of the history department at this university. I said, what's he so upset about? He ordered a book. We told him it would be there in 3 days, and now it's day 4 and it still hasn't come. This is someone who has not done any jihad nafs, has never worked on his ego or his character, and yet I'm sure if I asked him stuff, he'd have whole hordes of tons of information about history. He'd know more about it than anything I would possibly know or even want to know. Full of intellectual knowledge, all connected with analytical, logical premises, etc., in a terrible state. Someone like that should not be teaching. But far be it for the administrators to notice these subtleties of existence. So hal, the hal of a person, try to learn to read the hal. It's all in the hal. Don't think it's so small to look for the hal. It's all in the hal. H-A-L, the state. It can also be called, the New Agers call it the vibration, the vibe. This person puts off a bad vibe. That's the hal. They picked up the hal. And some of the New Agers, they had some understanding of this. A word connected with the hal is makam. Now, makam, hal is translated as state, and makam is translated as station. In other words, the hal is temporary and the makam is permanent, but the distinction is a little more nuanced than black and white. The classical Sufi teaching is that you receive a hal from Allah's generosity as a gift, and then you have to work to recuperate that hal. And when you work at it, it becomes permanent. But it's a bit too theoretical a format. But I think there's some truth in it, but it's not that cut and dry. When I first went when I first got interested in the spiritual path, one of the first places I went to was Krishnamurti in Ojai, California. And while I was there, I met this guy who was Joe Plumber America. Wasn't like the usual spiritual seekers, the hippies and the New Agers and the dropouts and the marijuana addicts. It wasn't at all like that. He was like typical Joe American. I said, "What are you doing here? You don't fit." You know? He said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "Actually, I'm a Korean War veteran." Ah, interesting. He said, during the Korean War, now this was 1973, this event happened. I think it was 75, one of the two. Anyway, Korean War was in the 50s, 53 or something. Been 20 years. He said, I had an experience. I was in the trenches. He said, this was the ugliest, most horrible place you could possibly be in. You know, he was obviously with the United Nations troops, and the Chinese and North Koreans were on the other side. And he said, in the middle of one of my in these trenches, there were dead bodies, there was blood, there was gore, there was mud. He said, you couldn't imagine a worse place. And then I was hit by an artillery shell. The moment I was hit by this artillery shell, I kind of left my body, and I was in this place of, we're going to talk about awe. What's the word for awe? Haiba. In this place of awe, and this was a beautiful, holy, cosmic battle going on. The exact opposite of the ugliness I saw on earth. And he said, that state was so amazing, in other words, that hal was so amazing that I've spent the last 20 years trying to rediscover it. So he got on the spiritual path that way, and sometimes that's what happens. There's a lot of terms we could cover here. It's not, these are probably the most important ones, the ones we've mentioned. Nafs, ruh, kalb, hal, makam. Another one that is relevant, I think, maybe we'll stop with that one temporarily, is kabd and bast with the Sufi. Kabd is constriction. So it's the equivalent of the psychological state of anxiety or angst, but there's a kind of spiritual constriction. You know, maybe the Christian mystics called it the dark night of the soul, you know, where you really feel really bad. You're hitting rock bottom, as they say in AA, you have to touch rock bottom. So you're hitting rock bottom, you're in this state of contraction, and then something breaks, like this man in the trenches in contraction, gets hit by an artillery shell, and suddenly he's in bast, expansion, everything, the lightness of being, the peace beyond all understanding. That's the bast. And of course, as Sufis, we love the bast. But we also have to endure the kabd, because it's part of the process. And in order to get to the wajd, which is perhaps the last term we'll cover, which is ecstasy, you got to go through agony, you know, like in that famous book and film, The Agony and the Ecstasy. You can't avoid one. They go together. So you're in this stage of contraction, kabd, and then suddenly it all opens up. Like, we'll finish with a personal story of this occurring. I was in Jerusalem, I had an accident, I fell down on those metal toilets right face forward, and I thought my nose was broken, it probably was, and I was in total misery, and I went to the local, they're in the news now, UNRWA, you know, supplying the Palestinians with humanitarian aid. I went to their hospital, they were incompetent there, and then I went to the Hebrew hospital, and I was in misery the whole time. At some point, this was like my own artillery shell, something broke, and there was a little voice in my mind saying, "What are you worried about? What's the big deal?" I mean, the worst possible scenario is I'd have to get reoperated. It wasn't the end of the world. What are you worried about? And the whole thing broke. And then I was in Wajd. I was in the oneness of being, in an ecstatic state of divine consciousness. From total misery, kabd, to openness, absolute openness. Alhamdulillah. These are part of the mysteries of the universe. So I'm just giving you a taste of the Sufi terminology. Maybe some of it will make sense, some of it won't. You can always research any of these subjects, and please do. Don't just rely. The millennials especially are a lazy generation. Sorry to have to say it, but they're lazy in terms of they want to be spoon-fed. Research. If there's anything here that catches your attention and you want to find out more, research it. We have amazing resources now. You can find so many things on Google, and if you can't find them on Google, look for some of the references, and you can order the book from Amazon, the local libraries that will get you the book. Research, look into these things. I was just hearing an educator today on the radio, and he was talking about using AI, which I'm not a big fan of at all, but he said, the important thing is to engage the students. He's right. I'm deficient in that sometimes. I just tell people the truth and expect them to act on it. But engage with people, and engage with yourself, and engage with the sources of the knowledge, and find out, because there's a lot of things that you have to learn on your own by your own research. So please, do your homework. Don't just make this into spiritual entertainment, or I would have wasted my time doing more spiritual entertainment. I want to be a door opener for you. That's why we start all our spiritual practices, even today, with Al-Fatiha, the opening. May Allah give you openings to understanding these various states and these various terms, so that it helps to uplift you and ultimately give you the experience of the divine presence. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun wa salamun ala mursalin walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Al-Fatiha.